As World War II approached its end, Benito Mussolini saw defeat coming and made his escape. Spoiler, he didn't make it. Here's what was going on the day Mussolini died. The exact details of Benito Mussolini's death are somewhat murky. However, most people agree that, as it became clear that the Axis would lose, he fled Milan, heading north toward Switzerland.
He was on the run. He was desperate. He was running for his life.
Despite being disguised as a member of the German Luftwaffe, he was easily recognized and captured, then taken to a small town near Lake Como. There, he was executed by machine gun fire. Walter Adizio, an Italian resistance member and later communist politician, claimed to be the executioner. Whether or not Adizio fired the fatal shots is a matter of debate. He claimed that a machine gun and pistol both jammed before he got his hands on a working machine gun. According to the New York Times, Adizio boasted, "I had the impression of shooting not a man, but an inferior being." He went on to say that in his eyes, Mussolini died a coward. An account in the Sydney Morning Herald described Mussolini trying to bargain with his captors, reportedly even claiming, "Save my life and I will give you an empire." Obviously, his pleas and those of his mistress, Claretta Petacci, fell on deaf ears. Mussolini's last words were cries of "no, no," as the weapons aimed at him. Despite the cult of personality Mussolini cultivated in the early years of his rule, by war's end he was far less popular.
"I don't care about being assassinated," he wrote to Clara Petacci. "In fact, I hope for it."
The reactions of the people of Milan tell the story. Before dawn on April 29th, shortly after Mussolini's execution, his body was dumped into the infamous Piazzale Loreto, the same place where fascists had displayed the bodies of the Italian resistance fighters 8 months prior. Now it was Mussolini's body, along with 15 other fascists, out on display, and the public was free to express their rage. An article in the New York Times read, "The man who once boasted that he was going to restore the glories of ancient Rome is now a corpse in a public square in Milan, with a howling mob cursing and kicking and spitting on his remains." The angry mob beat Mussolini's dead body, threw food at it, and eventually took the corpses to a nearby gas station, where they strung them up by the feet in a grotesque display.
Horrible. Dreadful. Negative. I'm ashamed that the resistance did that.
One woman even took out a pistol and fired at the body, yelling, "5 shots for my 5 assassinated sons." Later that afternoon, American soldiers who collected the bodies found Mussolini beaten beyond recognition. It's not surprising to hear that citizens of Allied nations were pleased with the news that Mussolini was dead. That said, media outlets had something of a field day announcing the news to the public. The New York Times came up with the bold headline, "A fitting end to a wretched life." And Universal News opened that day's TV news broadcast with a startling all-caps declaration, "Mussolini executed." That report continued with equally colorful language.
Bombastic Mussolini, the sawdust Caesar, comes to his end in the gutter. Fitting climax to a life of treachery and double-cross.
The newsreel wove together the story of how Il Duce's grand dreams of conquest were ultimately ruined by his alliance with Adolf Hitler. The next few days after Mussolini's death were a flurry of activity for the New York Times, with a reporter so eager to transmit exclusive photos of Mussolini's body surrounded by people in the Piazzale Loreto that he drove 125 miles through a blizzard just to do so, and for seemingly good reason. The paper's night editor claimed, "I think that next to the Iwo Jima flag raising, this is the second best picture of the year." April 28, 1945 is not exactly a day that people just know off the top of their heads as some historic milestone date, but remarkably, a lot of significant things happened on the same day Mussolini died. On that very night, Hitler began dictating his will, having no intention of living long enough to witness defeat. In that will, he mentioned his longtime girlfriend Eva Braun, whom he refused to marry in order to retain his female supporters, writing, "After many years of true friendship, she came of her own free will in order to share my fate. She will go to her death with me at her own wish as my wife." He married her in the middle of the night. The small wedding party included a local registrar who was awakened and shuttled to Hitler's bunker to conduct the ceremony, though he'd never met the Führer in person. Both Hitler and Braun affirmed that they were of pure Aryan origin, a requirement for Nazi weddings, and the small group held a short celebration complete with champagne. We can set aside the irony that Hitler wasn't of pure Aryan blood because no one protested his heritage at the time.
As Eva signs the wedding certificate, she writes the letter B for Braun before scoring it out and writing Hitler.
Not that the marriage lasted long. They were both dead by suicide 36 hours later. There were a lot of questions as to why Hitler did himself in, but Mussolini's fate may have played a role.
It's the abuse of Mussolini's corpse that leads Hitler to make a decision to actually kill himself, a few days later.
At this point in time, it was clear that the Axis powers had no chance of winning the war. German and Italian officers could see defeat on the horizon, and in an effort to save himself, one Nazi official, Heinrich Himmler, actually tried to surrender to the Allies. Himmler wasn't some low-ranking Nazi officer. On the contrary, he was the leader of the SS and largely responsible for the formation of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police.
By the late 1930s, Himmler is the most powerful man in the Nazi state machine, second only to Hitler.
Beyond that, he's heavily credited with the implementation of the final solution, the industrialized mass murder of European Jews. But after an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler in mid-1944, Himmler began to consider making peace with the Allies. A year later, in April 1945, he opened the door to negotiations, although they ultimately fell through. But the situation became dire enough that on April 28th or 29th, he reached out to the vice president of the Swedish Red Cross with an offer of surrender intended for the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces. That would be none other than the future US President Dwight D. Eisenhower. What exactly happened to that transmission is a bit murky, but at some point in those 2 days, Hitler got wind of Himmler's attempt to surrender. He ordered that Himmler be arrested and stripped of his position, and Himmler tried to flee. So in about a day and a half, give or take, Mussolini dies, Himmler tries to surrender, and Hitler is dead. Pretty remarkable for a date that's largely forgotten today. Dachau was among the most infamous of the Nazi death camps. Located just north of Munich, Dachau was the first regular concentration camp established in Germany, holding thousands of prisoners from 1933 to 1945, including prisoners of war, political prisoners, Jews, and plenty of others targeted for being different. As Allied forces approached the area, rumors spread in the camp about possible liberation. As positive as liberation sounds, the reality was that many prisoners feared how the Nazis would react. Would they all be relocated? A move that could easily kill those in poor physical condition? Would they be executed just so they could be denied freedom?
Under Himmler's orders, no prisoner can fall into the hands of the enemy alive.
SS officers were in fact panicking. There's actually a very specific reason that facilitated that panic, so keep watching so you can find out that forgotten story. Leaders got busy burning any and all documentation, forcing prisoners to help with the process, and even forbade anyone to move corpses to mass graves. Bodies piled up all around the camp. Then officers marched 7,000 prisoners to another camp, a death march that probably killed about 1,000 people. As Allied forces liberated camps throughout April 1945, they were just outside the city on April 28th and eventually arrived at the Dachau camp on April 29th, liberating those that had managed to survive. The idea of a worldwide peacekeeping organization had been around for a long time. The 1919 League of Nations wasn't even the first example, and while it proved fairly ineffectual, its failure provided a blueprint for a more successful organization. The outbreak of World War II ignited a widespread desire for a successful peacekeeping organization, with many nations discussing just what it would look like. Various charters and negotiations took place during the war, and at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, leaders set an official date to charter a new entity, the United Nations. So in late April, 850 delegates representing 50 different countries arrived at the San Francisco conference with the goal of setting the groundwork for the United Nations.
And the world, as well as San Francisco, rejoices over great progress made.
Those talks included debates over how to use military power and a way to ensure equal influence for all nations, regardless of relative size. These debates led to the creation of the Security Council, the executive body of the UN, a general assembly in which all nations would be equally represented, and the International Court of Justice, meant to deal with international law. The charter wouldn't be fully completed until June 25th, but by April 28th, despite the war not even being over yet and Germany's surrender not yet complete, delegates were already busy designing the UN. For more context as to what was happening in Germany at the close of the war, look no further than the Battle of Berlin. Soviet armies relentlessly attacked the city between April 20th and May 2nd. The conflict caused some 100,000 Soviet casualties and an unrecorded number of German casualties. It's widely considered one of the deadliest battles of World War II, but the truly devastating part of the battle doesn't come from the statistics. In the rush to capture Berlin, the Soviet army inflicted barbaric acts on the people of Berlin, whom they'd stopped seeing as human beings. They drove tanks into the streets and fired at buildings with little care for civilian casualties. Berliners hid in cellars, hoping to save themselves from the artillery. But that wasn't enough. The Soviet soldiers took to tossing grenades inside, hoping to kill soldiers, and not caring if civilians were caught in the crossfire. Some people tried hanging white flags on their windows despite fear of reprisal from SS officers, and others desperately hoped that the Americans would arrive, if only to drive the Red Army away. Then there were the women of Berlin. While the first Soviet soldiers were apparently relatively professional, the same couldn't be said of the later arrivals. It reported 100,000 Berlin women were sexually assaulted by Soviet troops, and there are stories of women prepared to leap from windows just to get away. April 28, 1945 was a dark day for the citizens of Berlin. While many events of the time have been well documented and committed to the collective memory, there's one that's been largely forgotten: the Bavarian Freedom Action. In Munich, a German commander named Ruprecht Gerngross put together a small resistance group of like-minded German soldiers. These were different from the SS troops, so many of them were conscripted into the German army and had zero admiration for the Nazi regime. They amassed a sizable arsenal of weapons and formed ties with a local militia. Then on April 28th, Gerngross and his rebels took over the local radio station and transmitted a message urging the people to fight back against the Nazis and wave white flags as a show of surrender to the approaching American forces. The message even reached Dachau, where the SS troops panicked and prisoners took advantage of the chaos and joined the rebellion. Unfortunately, the effort was short-lived. SS officials at Dachau composed themselves eventually and moved in to suppress the rebellion, killing a number of resistance fighters. Nonetheless, this uprising is still considered one of the only successful revolts carried out against the Nazi regime. Plus, it's largely credited with sparing the city of Munich from complete destruction, as German forces decided against defending it, allowing the American forces to arrive relatively unopposed. April 28, 1945 turned out to be one of the most incredible days in the history of World War II.